It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind where the suburban town felt just right as the sun began to set. Ethan had wrapped up his work and stepped outside to enjoy the tranquility of his surroundings. His thoughts wandered to the simple joys of nature, the singing birds and the gentle rustle of leaves. That's when he heard a sound that interrupted his calm. At first, he thought it might be a bird calling out, but as the noise grew louder, a sense of unease settled in. This wasn't the song of a bird, it was the cry of a kitten. His heart raced as he followed the increasingly frantic sounds. When he reached the edge of his porch, he spotted a mother cat standing there, her fur tangled and her eyes wide with fear. In her mouth, she carried something small and fragile, a tiny kitten that seemed barely alive. The mother cat looked up at Ethan, her eyes glistening as if pleading for help. With great care, she laid the kitten at his feet, as if she understood he could be its savior. Ethan felt a rush of emotions as he knelt down, his heart pounding. The kitten's tiny body shook, struggling for each breath. There was no time to lose. He gently picked up the kitten, aware that this moment would lead him on an unexpected journey. It struck him how surreal the situation was. As he looked down at the little creature, its fur matted and eyes barely open, time seemed to stand still. The mother cat, Tess, kept her gaze fixed on her baby, trembling as if the weight of her worry was too much for her to bear. The fear in her eyes told a story all on its own. The kitten felt so incredibly fragile in his hands. He could see its ribcage rise and fall with labored breaths, a clear sign it had endured too much already. Ethan glanced up at Tess, sensing her deep need for something, perhaps for him to act. A complex mix of responsibility and helplessness washed over him. Mira arrived shortly after. She had been one of his friends for years, and together they had seen their fair share of rescue stories. Her presence brought a flicker of hope amidst the uncertainty that lay ahead. She paused for a moment when she saw Tess and the kitten. "Ethan, this is..." Her voice trailed off. "I've never seen anything like this." I could only nod, feeling overwhelmed. I think it's dying." I hesitated to say it aloud, but deep down, I understood it was true. The kitten's breathing was so shallow, its small body barely moving. Mira sprang into action, wrapping the kitten in a warm blanket and checking its condition. Tess, however, stayed close, her eyes fixed on her baby, seemingly waiting for permission to let go. My heart ached for her. The desperation I saw in Tess's eyes reflected my own fears for the kitten. Yet there was also a bond forming between us. She trusted me, and I felt the weight of that responsibility. As Mira worked, Sophie arrived. Always the optimist, she wore a hopeful expression. But even she seemed taken aback at the sight of the kitten. "We can save it, right? We've saved worse," she said, her voice filled with determination. I wanted to share her optimism, but something inside me sensed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just another rescue. It felt different, like a pivotal moment. The next few hours flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Mira created a warm spot for the kitten, diligently looking for any signs of life. Sophie hovered nearby, offering encouraging words, but even she recognized the seriousness of the kitten's condition. Tess paced around us, her eyes wide with fear. Each time we moved, she would inch closer to inspect our efforts, but then revert to her corner, her anxiety tangible in the air. "Mira, you need to keep an eye on her," I heard, Mira's voice steady yet urgent as she worked. "She's watching you. You're the one she trusts to keep her baby safe." I nodded, unsure of how I could protect her kitten. I was just an ordinary guy caught in a challenging situation, not a hero. The thought of saving the kitten felt daunting, but Tess remained close, too protective for me to brush aside the guilt that washed over me every time I looked at her. Sophie crouched beside me, concern etched on her face. "What if we need to call in more help?" she whispered. "Maybe the shelter." "I don't think we have time for that," I replied, my voice strained. "We'll do what we can here. If it's meant to be, maybe we can save it." Mira looked at me, her face serious. "But not every rescue ends the way we hope, Ethan." I turned my gaze to Tess, who was sitting a few feet away, watching us intently but saying nothing. I knew Mira was right. The future of the kitten we were trying to help, and Tess's future too, was uncertain. We couldn't be sure that we could save her. The kitten's small body seemed to struggle with each tiny movement, as if it was fighting hard to hang on. Tess brushed against my legs, her eyes searching mine, as if she was asking for reassurance. I felt a weight in my chest. This situation had grown beyond just a rescue. It felt like a choice that defined us and tested who we might become in uncertain times. What were we going to do? Should we take the kitten to the shelter? Could we give Tess and her baby the home they needed? Or would it be kinder to let them go, to return them to the wild where they might have a better chance? And beneath all these questions loomed a bigger one. Could we together make the right choice when it mattered most? The next morning brought a surprising turn of events. I woke to soft meowing outside my window. At first, it sounded like just another stray cat. But when I opened the door, I was taken aback. There was Tess, looking more frantic than before, and this time she was not alone. Another kitten, even more fragile than the first, was with her. I rushed outside, my heart racing. Tess had left her first baby behind to bring us another tiny life that appeared just as sick. She gently placed the new kitten in front of me. As I looked down, dread filled my thoughts. The kitten's breathing was shallow, its fur was matted, and its eyes barely opened. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Mira and Sophie joined me outside, and for a brief moment we were silent, taking it all in. What did Tess know that we didn't? Why had she come back to us again with another sick kitten? Mira quickly examined the new kitten, and her expression changed. "It's not good," she said quietly. "We might be too late." I was shocked. This felt more than just chance. Tess seemed to trust us to care for her kittens, to know where to bring them. But why us? What had compelled her to seek us out not once but twice in a single day? As these questions swirled in my mind, a new realization began to set in. We might be part of something larger than just a rescue. We found ourselves facing a new challenge with Tess and her kittens. Something was different, and it was hard to tell if this was a fortunate turn or an added responsibility. Mira carefully held the new kitten as we all stepped back inside. The atmosphere felt heavy with uncertainty. Should we attempt to save both kittens, or would that only lead to more suffering? Tess, usually there with her unwavering presence, seemed restless as she paced in tight circles. It was as if we were all caught in a web of unspoken worries with no clear answers. The return of Tess with another ailing kitten transformed our situation. Now we weren't just dealing with one fragile life, but two, complicating our plans further. As the reality unfolded, I could feel the tension. Mira spoke first, her tone calm, though her concern was evident. "Ethan, this is a lot for us. We can't take in every stray or injured animal. The shelter is already stretched thin." Her words struck a chord with me. I understood the weight of our responsibility. Yet seeing both kittens so fragile made everything seem daunting. I glanced at Tess, who watched us intently, her eyes full of anxiety. It felt like she was waiting for a decision, but I wasn't sure what to tell her. Sophie, meanwhile, was already brainstorming solutions. "We can make this happen," she said, her determination shining through. "We've rescued countless animals before. We'll find our way." While her optimism was refreshing, I couldn't shake off the gravity of the reality we faced. These kittens were weak, and their chances of survival seemed slim. Could we truly succeed this time? I turned to Mira, contemplating options. "We can try, can't we? We have the means. We've done it in the past." Mira shook her head, her expression serious. "Ethan, you're not fully grasping the situation. These kittens are not like the others we've helped. They're too far gone. Trying to intervene might just extend their suffering." Her words hit hard. I wanted to fight for them, to give them a chance after everything they had endured. But Mira's worries lingered in my mind, leading me to question if we truly had their best interests at heart. Tess, who had been pacing anxiously, suddenly sat down and lowered her head. It felt as though she sensed our internal struggle, and I could see the trust she had in us beginning to fade. She was starting to wear down, and I couldn't help but question whether she was grasping how serious things had become. Sophie knelt beside me, her tone softer now. "We can't give up on them, Ethan. They need us. I believe we can do this." But could we really? As the days passed, that question lingered in my mind. The stakes felt higher than I first thought, and our connection with the animals seemed to deepen and become more complex with each passing moment. This journey was turning into something more than just saving cats. It was evolving into something richer, yet uncertain. Just when we were trying to find our way forward, everything changed. One morning, an unexpected storm rolled in. The clouds were thick and dark, blocking out the sky. Rain poured down in sheets, hammering against the windows and turning the outside world into a blur. This sudden shift in weather added a sense of urgency. The shelter we had hoped to reach was now inaccessible due to flooded roads. Our home, while warm and inviting, wasn't equipped to provide the level of care the kittens required. Still, Tess was determined to stay. She remained close, always alert and waiting. Mira, Sophie, and I scrambled to stabilize the kittens, but we couldn't disregard the storm raging outside. It felt as though everything was closing in on us, increasing our anxiety. There was no escaping the rising pressure, both inside the house and from the elements. Amid this chaos, the phone rang. It was the local animal control officer. "We've received a report of a wild cat colony near the river," he said, his voice tight. "They've been causing trouble for local farms. We need to know if you're planning to keep the mother and her kittens. We can't allow more feral cats in the area." His words struck hard. It was evident the situation had grown even more complicated. Tess and her kittens were now caught in a struggle between our desire to help and the mounting pressure from the community. The officer seemed unconcerned about our bond with these animals. He was focused solely on the broader issue of wild cats becoming a nuisance. Mira ended the call, her expression pale. "We have to make a choice," she said quietly. "This isn't just about the kittens anymore. It's about Tess and her future too." The clock was ticking. With each hour that passed, the storm outside continued to rage, and the pressure to make a choice grew more intense. Were we truly providing Tess and her kittens the safety they needed, or were we inadvertently putting them in a difficult situation? As I gazed at Tess, her weary expression reflected my own uncertainty. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. In the days that followed, the situation weighed heavily on all of us. While the storm had calmed, the atmosphere in the house remained tense. The kittens were struggling, and Tess, who had once been so trusting, seemed to withdraw. She would watch us from a distance with a resigned look, as if she sensed we might not be able to save her little ones. I found myself sitting beside them for hours, trying to provide comfort. Yet the persistent question lingered in my mind. Were we truly acting in their best interest? What if our desire to keep them alive was only prolonging their suffering in an unsuitable environment? Sophie was the first to share her doubts. "Ethan, what if we're just keeping them here for ourselves? What if we're too attached to see what's best for them?" Her voice trembled, and I could see tears in her eyes. Sophie had always been the one to cling to hope, but now even she seemed to hesitate. Mira was also feeling conflicted. She was trying to stay focused on what needed to be done, but I could see her doubts surfacing. Although she wasn't as emotionally invested as Sophie or I, she still felt a strong bond with the animals. The weight of her responsibility seemed heavier each day. As for me, I was uncertain about the right course of action. Every time I looked at Tess, a wave of guilt washed over me. Was I ready to set aside my own feelings in pursuit of what was best for them? Or would I continue to fight for their lives, even if it might worsen their situation? One afternoon, I noticed Tess quietly sitting in the corner, her gaze fixed on her kittens. That's when I began to wonder if Tess understood something we hadn't yet grasped. She had chosen to bring her kittens to us, trusting that we would make the right decision for their future. What if letting them go was the right choice? I couldn't shake that thought. Was it better to release them into a world that might be tougher than what they faced here? Yet, holding on to them wasn't simple either. It felt like there was no perfect answer. The emotional stress was starting to weigh heavily on all of us. We found ourselves torn between what was best for Tess and her kittens and what we needed for ourselves. Could we set aside our own feelings to make the right choice? As the days grew darker, our situation with Tess and her kittens worsened. The external pressure of the storm was still a concern, but the emotional turmoil inside the house was becoming harder to ignore. The more we cared for the kittens, the clearer it became that we were running out of options. Tess began to act differently. She seemed more distant, as if she sensed our uncertainty. It was unsettling and made me feel like she was retreating, both emotionally and physically. One evening, I found myself in the living room, gazing at the kittens and questioning how much longer we could pretend we had control. The house felt smaller and quieter, weighed down by the decisions we hadn't yet addressed. Then, something unexpected occurred. I heard a soft scratching sound outside the door. At first, I dismissed it as the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I stood up and approached the door. When I opened it, I was met by two glowing eyes. Two other cats, anxious and thin, stood just outside. They hesitated as if waiting for something. I froze, unsure of the significance of their presence. Were they here to join Tess, or was there a deeper reason for their arrival? The cats didn't move closer. They simply stood, looking into the house with a mix of curiosity and caution. I called for Mira, who hurried over, concern etched on her face. "What is it? What's happening?" I gestured toward the cats outside. "They've been watching us. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just a coincidence." Mira paused to take it in. "They belong to the colony," she replied quietly, her expression focused. "They've been keeping tabs on Tess, and now it seems they're drawn to us." A chill ran down my spine. Were these cats part of something bigger? Had they been observing Tess, perhaps waiting for her return? Or was there something more unsettling at play? The thought that we might be in deeper than we realized began to settle in. Could this mean that things were slipping out of our control? Sophie, who had been quietly standing in the corner, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "What if they're not here to help us? What if they want to take Tess and her kittens? We might be entangled in something far beyond our understanding." The presence of the two wild cats added a new layer of uncertainty to our situation. They weren't just part of the natural world outside. They served as a stark reminder that we were involved in a larger conflict, one that felt beyond our grasp. Did Tess actually trust us, or was she leading us into circumstances we couldn't manage? This question lingered in my mind as I watched the mysterious cats, their glowing eyes reflecting the faint light of the stormy evening. My uncertainty deepened, and I remained without answers. The wild cats didn't leave. They waited just out of reach, their eyes always alert, as if they were watching for something. Mira had attempted to get closer to them once, but they dashed into the shadows. It felt intentional, like they were avoiding us, yet ensuring we knew they were there. Constant reminders that Tess and her kittens were part of something far greater. We could no longer overlook their presence. I noticed a change in Tess as well. She seemed quieter, almost retreating, no longer pacing and checking on her kittens as frequently. It felt as if a new urgency had taken hold of her, a sense that something was looming ahead. I could sense her tension growing day by day, as if she were waiting for the right moment to act. The relationship between Tess and her kittens also began to shift. Dusty, the smaller kitten, appeared to grow weaker by the day, while Shadow, the larger one, showed more resilience. Shadow would often snuggle against Tess for comfort, while Dusty remained distant, lying still in the corner, hardly responding to our warmth and attention. It was heartbreaking to witness, yet it highlighted just how delicate our situation had become. One afternoon, while I sat by the fire with Sophie, Mira went to check on the kittens. When she returned, her face was pale. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "I have to tell you something. Dusty isn't responding. It feels like he's just given up." The impact of her words struck me hard. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a sinking sensation in my stomach. "He's lying there, not moving at all. His breathing is very faint. We can try to keep him warm, but I don't think he'll pull through." My heart felt heavy. I understood that this was more than just giving up. Dusty had reached a point where his survival was beyond our control. His stillness seemed to say something profound. There was little we could do now. Yet Tess wouldn't leave his side. No matter what attempts we made, she stayed devoted to Dusty. I watched her gently nudge him, hoping for some response, but he remained still. It was heartbreaking to witness her fierce love for a kitten who was slipping away. In contrast, Shadow, the other kitten, had his own response. He often sought our comfort, nuzzling against us. But I noticed something shifting in his behavior. It was like he sensed the tension in the room. Tess would gently push him back into the corner. as if trying to protect him from the reality unfolding before us. Could it be that Tess understood in some way what lay ahead for Dusty, and she wanted to spare Shadow from the same fate? The bond between Tess, her kittens, and the wild cats outside seemed increasingly intertwined. While Tess clung tightly to her babies, something felt amiss. Why had the wild cats appeared at this moment? Why had Tess brought her kittens to us only for them to struggle? As we desperately tried to help, I began to question whether Tess held knowledge we weren't privy to, something that could change our entire perspective on this rescue. As the storm raged outside and silence enveloped our home, I could feel the heavy tension. It was as if we were all caught in a web of uncertainty, our emotions swinging between hope and helplessness. The harder we tried to help, the more it seemed we were on the edge of losing everything. Days began to blend into one another, wariness creeping in. We weren't far from a decision, but none of us felt clear enough to make it. Dusty's condition was declining, and with time slipping away, it grew increasingly tough to ignore reality. His small body was becoming colder, despite our efforts to keep him warm. It was evident that we were facing a losing battle, yet accepting that truth felt unbearable. Tess seemed to understand this too. She would linger near Dusty, gently nudging him, but he seemed distant, lacking the spark he once had. Gone was the anxious mother who had arrived so worried. Now she appeared almost resigned. Each time I saw her, a wave of guilt washed over me. It felt like she had accepted what was happening, and in her acceptance, my own emotions started to unravel. How could I let her down at this moment? In contrast, Shadow was becoming more lively and curious. He wandered around the house, sniffing corners and exploring every nook, as if trying to make sense of his new surroundings. It was as if he was clinging to life in a way Dusty couldn't. Still, I knew deep down that we couldn't keep him forever. It was clear we couldn't save both of them. Then came the phone call that pushed me to my breaking point. It was the animal control officer again. "Ethan, I need an answer. You can't keep them there indefinitely. You either release them back into the wild, or we'll take them in. But I must warn you, we are not equipped to handle cats in such condition." His tone was practical and stark. It felt like everything we had done, all the care and compassion we had shown, was being reduced to a simple choice: release or surrender. I struggled to find the words. How could I just let them go? How could I send Tess and her kittens back into uncertainty when they had trusted us? Yet, if we didn't act soon, we might face a loss that would be even harder to bear. Sophie, who was standing beside me, finally spoke up, her voice soft yet heavy with emotion. "Ethan, we can't keep them here indefinitely. I know it feels like we're failing, but maybe it's time to let them go. Perhaps this is the only way they can be free." Her words resonated in my mind, cutting through the officer's demand. I glanced at her and then at Tess, who was watching us with those hopeful eyes. How was I supposed to make this choice? How could I weigh the need to protect them against the need to set them free? Was it even fair to keep them here, knowing the pressure we faced? Mira, who had been quiet for some time, finally spoke. "You know what you need to do, Ethan. The decision isn't easy, but it's necessary. The longer we wait, the worse it gets for all of us." She was right. Each day felt like a missed opportunity, another step closer to a decision I dreaded. The tension in the air had reached a breaking point, and it was clear that whatever choice I made, the outcome was unpredictable for all of us. The future was unclear, and the choices ahead seemed to spark more questions than answers. As I held Dusty, the tiny kitten felt so delicate in my hands. I turned to Tess, who was waiting expectantly. The pressure to make a decision weighed heavily on me. The atmosphere in the room felt thick with tension. Mira and Sophie stood nearby, their gaze fixed on me, awaiting my choice. Tess, who had been composed in her sorrow, now looked at me with an intensity that seemed to ask, "What will you choose?" My hands shook as I cradled Dusty. His little body felt fragile, and yet the responsibility of his life felt like a heavy burden. Mira's voice broke the silence. "Ethan, you need to decide. Are we letting them go, or are we taking them to the shelter?" Panic began to swell within me. "I don't know," I replied softly. "I just don't know what's best." Sophie spoke up in a gentle yet firm tone. "You're not deciding just for us, Ethan. You're deciding for them as well. Tess is counting on us. Dusty's life is fading, and there's nothing we can do to change that. But Shadow deserves a chance. Tess let out a quiet, sorrowful meow, her call filled with a longing I couldn't quite grasp. She moved closer, sitting a few feet away, her eyes locked on Dusty. She nudged him lightly, but he didn't respond. It was as if she understood the gravity of the situation. And in that moment, I realized how powerless she felt, trapped in circumstances beyond her control. I wished I could assure her everything would be fine, but uncertainty filled my heart. Mira let out a frustrated sigh, clearly struggling to hold it together. We're not helping anyone by prolonging this. We should let them go. If they're going to survive, it needs to be out there, in the wild. They can't stay here. Her words hit hard. I wasn't ready to say goodbye, especially after all we had done to try and save them. Still, Mira had a point. We weren't capable of giving Tess and her kittens the future they needed. They were wild at heart, not cut out for domestic life, no matter how much we wished it were otherwise. The earlier phone call had rattled me to my core. The animal control officer's directive echoed in my mind: release them or surrender them. It felt like an ultimatum, and with it came an overwhelming sense of burden, as if the weight of the world rested squarely on my shoulders. Could I really let them go? Was I betraying Tess's trust? Standing there, torn between my feelings and the reality of our situation, a new thought began to surface. Perhaps the right choice wasn't so much about what we could do for them, but what we could provide them. Freedom. The chance to be independent. Dusty might struggle, but Shadow could manage it. Tess had a chance too. They needed to return to their rightful place, no matter how difficult it was for me to accept. My heart grew heavy as I made my decision. We released them, I said softly, barely above a whisper. Sophie and Mira paused for a moment before nodding in agreement. It wasn't the choice any of us had hoped for, but it felt like the necessary one. Tess let out a gentle meow, and as I swung open the door to let them out, another wave of emotions hit me. I felt sorrow, but also a sense of relief. I was letting go, not because I wanted to, but because it was time. Watching Tess and Shadow slip into the night, I understood that sometimes the toughest choices lead to a feeling of peace. As the door closed behind us, the weight of the decision settled in like a heavy fog. I glanced back as Tess and Shadow vanished into the darkness, and a deep sadness filled me. Tess had looked to us for help, and now we were sending her back to a wild that we couldn't fully shield her from. Yet another feeling nagged at me, a quiet, unsettling doubt. Had I made the right choice? I couldn't shake the concern that maybe they weren't truly ready for this. Shadow, being the stronger of the two, would need to survive on his own. And Tess, did she fully understand what was happening? The hope that granting them their freedom would help them find their own path felt distant. Would they be okay without us? Turning back to the house, I shut the door, but it felt emptier than before. The silence enveloped me. Sophie stood beside me, quiet, since the moment we let them go. I could see the sorrow mirrored in her eyes, the same heaviness that gripped us all. "Do you think they'll be okay?" she finally asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, staring out at the dark, vacant space where they had been. "I hope so. I really do." I didn't have the answers. The futures of Tess, Shadow, and Dusty felt uncertain, much like an unanswered question. We had done everything within our power. We opened our hearts to them and offered them a chance. Still, the world outside remained unpredictable, and ultimately it was no longer up to us. Mira approached and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You made the right decision, Ethan," she said gently. "You gave them a chance. That's what matters." Her reassurance provided some comfort, but it did little to ease the emptiness I felt. I couldn't shake the worry about what lay ahead for Tess and Shadow. Would we look back on this decision as the right one? In truth, maybe there was no perfect choice. Perhaps it was simply about the next step, even when the path ahead seemed unclear. As the days went by, thoughts of our shared journey filled my mind. I reflected on the struggles we faced, the uncertainties we navigated, and how emotionally taxing it all had been. Where were Tess and Shadow now? Were they out in the wild thriving, or had their journey ended in a way we couldn't foresee? The answers were elusive. What became clear to me, however, was how much we had changed through this experience. We learned about ourselves, about sacrifice, and about the unpredictable nature of rescue. Some paths conclude with clear outcomes, while others leave us with more questions than answers. Standing there, gazing at the spot where Tess and Shadow had disappeared, a wave of feelings overwhelmed me. A weight settled in my chest that wouldn't lift. I had made the choice to let them go, but the pain of that choice lingered. The stillness of the night mirrored the silence in my heart. Had I truly done what was best for them, or had my own fears clouded my judgment? Just as I started to find some acceptance of my decision, I heard something. A soft cry in the distance shattered the quiet. My heart raced. Could it be Tess? Could it be Shadow? I held my breath as I turned toward the source of the sound, a spark of hope igniting within me. It didn't seem possible. They were supposed to be free, but that cry came again. I dashed toward the sound, Sophie and Mira right behind me. The moonlight lit our way, casting long shadows among the trees. And then, there she was. Tess stood at the edge of the woods, her eyes filled with panic. She was alone. Shadow was nowhere to be found, and Dusty was missing. As she looked at me, I could see her desperation. Was she back for help? Did something go wrong? Or had she returned because she needed to trust us again? My heart began to race as I moved closer, kneeling down to be at her level. She didn't run away. Instead, she stayed put, waiting for something, waiting for me. Sophie's voice broke the silence, soft and uncertain. "Ethan, what should we do now? She's back." I was caught off guard. I had let Tess and Shadow go, believing it was the right decision at the time. But now, here stood Tess, looking for help and protection. There was no turning back this time. The choices I made now would shape not only Tess and her kitten's future, but ours as well. I took a deep breath and slowly stood up, feeling the weight of my decision. I met Tess's gaze again and realized what I needed to do. I reached out my hand, and Tess stepped forward, nuzzling her head against it, a clear sign that she was asking for help. In that moment, it was no longer just about saving them. It was about the bond we had formed and the trust Tess was placing in us once more. She had come back, and turning her away was not an option, not again. I lifted Tess into my arms and walked back toward the house. I knew Shadow would find his way in time, but Tess had chosen us again, and I felt compelled to respond to that choice. We would support her and her kittens, wherever that path might lead. The following days were quieter. Welcoming Tess back into our home was a big step, but it felt right. We had done all we could for her and her kittens, and now she was returning to us, showing trust once more. Tess was no longer the frantic, fearful mother from weeks ago. She seemed calmer, more at ease, yet still vigilant. As for Shadow, he stayed out in the wild, as I hoped he would. He had vanished into the woods, likely charting his own course. I often thought about him, wondering if he was managing well and thriving in his own way. And Dusty's absence still weighed heavily on my heart. I couldn't shake the memory of that tiny, fragile kitten slipping away despite our best efforts. It served as a reminder of how little control we truly have over certain outcomes, no matter how hard we try. Despite these lingering thoughts, Tess's return offered a sense of healing. We were all adjusting to the unfamiliar, learning together as we navigated the unknown. She didn't need our rescue, but by reaching out to her, we found healing as well. This experience showed us that saving someone isn't solely about preserving life. It's about offering them a chance for something better, even if the outcome remains uncertain. Looking back, I recognize that the journey wasn't flawless. There were more questions than answers and greater uncertainty than resolution. Perhaps that's the essence of rescue. It's less about a perfect ending and more about the journey, the connections we forge, and the choices we make along that path. I can't predict what lies ahead for Tess or where Shadow might go. They might discover a new home, or they could return to the wild, living freely as they choose. Whatever happens, that's their journey. Our lives intersected, creating a bond that cannot be erased. One thing has become clear to me: sometimes the best choice isn't the one that guarantees the most favorable outcome. It's the choice that feels authentic, even when the answers are elusive. As I sit here watching Tess settle next to the fire, I realize this story may not conclude neatly. The future is still full of questions, but that's simply part of the rescue experience. The adventure goes on, filled with uncertainty, hope, and vibrant life. Reflecting on Tess's trust in us and the surprising turns her journey took, it's apparent that rescue transcends the act of saving lives. It involves making hard decisions and acknowledging that some aspects are beyond our control. While the path ahead for Tess and Shadow remains unclear, we've done what we could, and the lessons we've gathered will remain with us. If you found this story meaningful and would like to see more, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Join me as we continue this journey together. Your support is invaluable, allowing us to share these important moments of connection. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to our next adventure together.